long before the pharaohs carved their names into stone, long before pyramids rose above the sand and gods were painted onto temple walls, there was only the river, the Nile, wide, winding, steady. It did not rush, it breathed. It moved with the quiet confidence of something older than memory, older than man, older than time. In the heart of what would one day be Egypt, the Nile flowed northward, from the jungles and mountains of the south to the wide, fertile delta that kissed the Mediterranean Sea. It brought not only water, but life. In a land surrounded by desert, it was the single thread of green. Its floods arrived like clockwork, spilling over the banks, soaking the dry earth, leaving behind rich, dark silt. Plants grew, animals gathered, people followed. They built small huts from mud and reed. They hunted hippopotamuses, fished for catfish, tamed the wild flax and barley. They watched the sun rise and set and began to wonder, who made the stars? What waits after death? Why does the river return? These early settlers had no kings, no gods with names, no temples or tombs. But they had rhythm, and rhythm became ritual. Ritual became belief, and belief, over time, shaped civilization. They buried their dead in shallow graves, leaving behind tools, food, tokens of care, perhaps believing the journey continued beyond the dust. Over centuries, two cultures formed. One in the south, where cliffs towered and the river cut through stone. This was Upper Egypt. The other to the north, where the river fanned into marshes and green fields. This was Lower Egypt. They grew apart, yet remained connected by the Nile's eternal thread. Their customs diverged, their leaders rose, their conflicts simmered. But the gods they imagined were similar. Sky gods, river gods, gods of birth and decay. Somewhere between trade and war, between drought and flood, a ruler emerged, perhaps named Nama. He wore a crown of two colors, white for Upper Egypt, red for Lower Egypt. He united the lands, not only in conquest, but in idea. With him, the first dynasty began. The city of Memphis was founded, and from there the rule of kings, pharaohs, spread along the river. These kings were more than men. They were considered chosen by the gods, embodiments of divine order, of Ma'at. Law, balance and truth flowed from them as surely as water flowed from the Nile. Writing began, not sentences, but symbols, carved into ivory, onto pottery, and later stone. These marks recorded names, rituals, grain tallies, and stories. Villages became cities, shrines became temples, graves became tombs. Death was no longer an end, but a transformation. The soul, called the Ka, was eternal, provided the body remained intact and the rites were performed. And so, they planned for the afterlife as carefully as they planned for harvest. The Nile, year after year, whispered its steady secrets. Its floods were divine, its timing sacred. It taught them patience, discipline, and reverence. This was the beginning, not of a kingdom only, but of a mindset, a world shaped by cycles and shadow, by death and return, by time and silence. From the river's breath came belief, and from belief came Egypt. As Egypt stood at the edge of the ancient world's fading light, one final name rose, a name that would echo not just through hieroglyphs and papyrus, but through scrolls, plays, paintings, and legends. Cleopatra. She was not the first to bear that name. She was Cleopatra VII, the last in a long line of Greek rulers under the Ptolemaic dynasty. But she would be the last true pharaoh of Egypt. Born in 69 BCE, in a world already shifting beneath the weight of empires, She was raised in Alexandria, a city of marble columns, scroll-filled libraries, and foreign tongues. Though of Macedonian Greek descent, Cleopatra embraced the soul of Egypt. She spoke the Egyptian language, honored the native gods, and styled herself as the goddess Isis in human form. Her reign was marked not by quiet administration, but by survival, tact, brilliance, and dangerous alliances. She ruled in a time of crisis, when Rome's shadow stretched across the Mediterranean, and Egypt, once a kingdom of gods, had become a chessboard for foreign ambitions. Cleopatra ruled alongside her brother, then cast him aside. She navigated court politics, revolts, and economic strain, and when Roman General Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, she made her move, not with force but with genius. Legend says she entered the palace rolled in a rug, unveiled herself as queen, and won his trust and heart. Their union was political and personal. She bore him a son, Caesarion, and with his support secured her throne. But when Caesar was assassinated in Rome, the tides shifted again. Cleopatra turned to Mark Antony, one of Caesar's most powerful allies. Their relationship became legend, two rulers of unmatched charisma, bound by love and strategy. They lived in grandeur through lavish banquets and saw themselves as gods reborn. She is Isis, he is Dionysus. But Rome did not see romance, it saw threat. Octavian, Caesar's heir, used their affair as fuel for war. In 31 BCE, at the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra and Antony's fleets were defeated. They fled to Alexandria, their final refuge. Within a year, Octavian entered the city. Facing defeat, Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, refusing to be paraded in chains through Roman streets, chose death. Some say she was bitten by a cobra, others suggest poison. What mattered was her choice, to end her story on her own terms. With her death and the execution of Caesarion, Egypt fell, not into ruin, but into empire. It became a Roman province, its riches flowing outward, its temples slowly silenced, its gods relegated to stories. Alexandria continued to thrive as a center of knowledge and commerce. But the age of pharaohs was over. Cleopatra was the last monarch of the ancient Egyptian line that had endured for over 3,000 years. She was queen, diplomat, polyglot, strategist, and symbol. To some, she was seductress, to others savior. But above all, she was the last light of an ancient world, fierce, complex, and unforgettable. And so, with her fall, Egypt passed fully into memory, its independence lost, but its legacy sealed in stone, story, and starlight. The Nile continued to flow. The pyramids still stood, but the crown was gone, and the silence of empire settled like dust on the tombs of kings. No empire stands forever, not even one shaped by gods and guided by stars. As the golden age of the new kingdom faded into twilight, the firm grip of the pharaohs loosened. The grand temples of Karnak and Luxor still echoed with prayers, but beneath their painted ceilings, the machinery of Egypt began to slow. The long reign of Ramses II was followed by weaker kings, brief successions, and mounting troubles. Tombs were looted, workers went unpaid, records show strikes, the first in human history. The power of the priesthood, especially that of Amun in Thebes, rivaled the authority of the throne. Civil authority fractured, and the divine order of Ma'at, so carefully preserved, began to tilt. Egypt still looked grand, but cracks widened beneath the surface. Foreign powers watched, and soon they entered. The Libyans came first, settling in the western delta, slowly integrating into the fabric of Egyptian life. Some rose to power, even ruling as pharaohs, adopting the language, rituals, and iconography of Egypt. But they were not born of the Nile, and their loyalties were scattered. Then came the Nubians from the south, once subjects of empire, now rulers in their own right. The 25th dynasty, led by kings from Kush, swept north and took control. They revered Egyptian traditions, restored temples, and ruled with dignity, yet they were still seen as outsiders by many. Meanwhile, in the east, a greater threat loomed. The Assyrians, warlike and relentless, invaded with iron weapons and brutal tactics. They sacked Thebes, carried off treasures, and left smoke in their wake. Egypt, once the hammer, became the anvil. Brief recoveries came, but none lasted. The Site kings of the 26th dynasty tried to revive the old glories, commissioning art in the style of earlier times, restoring order along the Nile, rearming their forces. But time had shifted. Egypt was no longer the center of the world. It was a memory wearing a crown. The Persians arrived next, first under Cambyses, then again under Xerxes and Darius. They ruled not as Egyptian kings, but as foreign emperors, folding Egypt into a vast empire that stretched from India to the Mediterranean. They allowed temples to function, let priests perform rites, but the sovereignty was hollow. Revolts sparked and failed. Pride burned, but power did not return. Then came the Greeks. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Egypt, welcomed as a liberator. He visited the oracle at Siwa, was declared a son of Amun, and founded the city of Alexandria on the coast, a beacon of Hellenistic culture, knowledge, and trade. After his death, his general Ptolemy seized control, beginning the Macedonian dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies embraced Egyptian tradition on the surface, dressing as pharaohs, building temples, commissioning hieroglyphs, but underneath, they governed in Greek. The language of power changed, and the native Egyptians receded into the background of their own country. The gods remained, the rituals continued, but something had shifted. Egypt was now a jewel passed between empires, a land of myth more than destiny. The Nile still flowed, the temples still stood, but the voice of Egypt was softer now, less confident, more fragile. And as foreign boots echoed on stone floors, the land remembered a time when kings rose from its soil, when eternity was built with local hands, when the stars above were named in native tongues. The decline was not sudden, but slow, like a boat drifting from its mooring. And in that slow drift, the echo of Egypt's greatness became a haunting refrain carried on desert winds. Beneath the monuments and rituals, beyond the tombs and tablets, ancient Egypt pulsed with something intimate and eternal. Love, not the distant concept of royal alliances or divine unions, but the simple, universal yearning between two people. From the banks of the Nile to the shade of palm groves, lovers met, eyes lingered, hands brushed, and verses bloomed. The Egyptians were not ashamed of affection. They celebrated it. They wrote poetry that was tender, vivid, even sensual. In fragments on papyrus and shards of pottery, we find lines whispered across 3,000 years. Your love is mixed with my breath. It is in the scent of my oil. Young women were compared to flowers in bloom, their beauty like warm bread from the oven. Men wrote of longing, of heartache, of the thrill when their beloved passed by in the street. These were not stories of gods. They were moments of real people, etched in ink and memory. Marriage, too, was rooted not just in duty, but in companionship. A typical wedding had no lavish ceremony. but a simple agreement, mutual affection, and the sharing of a home. Husbands and wives worked side by side, planting, weaving, raising children. Family was the center of life. Children were treasured, often named after gods or ancestors, and families hoped for many. Even the gods themselves reflected these bonds. Isis and Osiris, the divine lovers, Nut and Geb, the sky and earth entwined. The art of the period often shows couples with arms around each other, seated close, gazing eye to eye. Love was not hidden, it was celebrated. Mothers played a sacred role. They nursed, taught, prayed. Some even rose to positions of power in temples or estates. Fathers provided, guided, and offered wisdom. In wealthier homes, children were taught to read and write. In humbler ones, they learned trades and traditions. Songs were sung to lull infants, stories told at twilight. Love was in the rhythm of life. Letters from husbands to wives, even when written stiffly by scribes, revealed tenderness. A soldier on campaign writes of how he misses the sound of his wife's voice. A widow writes prayers for the safe journey of her departed husband. Their words stretch across centuries with warmth undimmed. Festivals were times of joy and union. During the beautiful festival of the valley, families visited the tombs of ancestors, picnicked, drank wine, and celebrated both memory and togetherness. Even death did not sever bonds, it reaffirmed them. Tomb inscriptions speak of devotion beyond the grave. You shall be my wife in the west as you were in the east. Husbands and wives hoped to meet again in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, to walk hand in hand beside the waters. Music played a role in courtship. Harps and flutes filled gardens, and dancers entertained under moonlight. Perfume, oils, and flowers adorned both men and women. Cleanliness was not just ritual, it was romantic. They valued beauty not as vanity, but as expression. In the smallest amulets, in the graffiti on tomb walls, we glimpsed their emotional world. They were not so different from us. They loved deeply, lost painfully, remembered faithfully. Their hearts beat beneath the same stars. And though their words may now be faint, scratched into time's fading scroll, they remind us that even in the civilization of stone and ceremony, love was the truest monument of all. Beyond the palaces and pyramids, beneath the statues and gods, Egypt was lived not only by kings, but by millions of ordinary people, farmers, potters, bakers, scribes, and fishermen, who rose with the sun and rested with the stars. Their lives unfolded not in gold, but in earth. They planted wheat in the black silt left by the Nile's annual flood, worked barefoot in the fields, coaxing life from soil that glistened with promise. The rhythm of their days was set by nature and ritual. At dawn, the sound of wooden plows dragged by oxen broke the morning stillness. Children chased geese between huts. Women ground barley on flat stones. Men lifted water from canals using long, pivoted poles called shadows. Meals were simple. Flatbread, onions, dates, lentils, and beer brewed thick and dark from emmer wheat. In bustling towns and villages, markets hummed with barter. Copper tools exchanged for linen, baskets of figs swapped for sandals. Women played a vital role, not hidden in shadows, but present in homes, temples, and businesses. Some were priestesses, weavers, perfume makers, even doctors. Children learn early, by imitation, by repetition, by helping. They played with clay dolls and little carved animals, and when they grew older, boys might become apprentices to craftsmen or scribes. Scribes were the elite of the common world, those who knew the language of gods and kings, With reed pens and black-red ink, they wrote contracts, tallied grain, copied hymns, and filled tomb walls with stories of creation and eternity. Education for a scribe was strict. Teachers beat errors with rods, discipline etched as deeply as the symbols they carved. Yet theirs was a respected life, clean, clever, and close to power. Houses for most Egyptians were made of mud brick, cool in the heat, simple in form. Courtyards were central spaces for cooking and gathering. Oil lamps flickered at night, and beds were woven with cords or reeds. Cleanliness was vital. People bathed daily in the Nile or in basins at home, rubbed scented oils into their skin, and shaved their bodies to avoid lice and heat. Cosmetics were not just vanity, they were protection. Black coal lined the eyes to guard against glare and flies, while green pigment and crushed galena adorned lids with style and symbolism. Music drifted through alleys and along fields, harps, flutes, tambourines, and the soft clapping of hands accompanied songs of love, harvest, and gods. Festivals filled the calendar, celebrations of Ra's journey, the rising of Sirius, the flooding of the Nile. People drank, danced, and gave thanks. Religious life was omnipresent, not in weekly sermons, but in daily gestures. Amulets hung from necks, incense burned at shrines, prayers whispered while grinding grain. Every action was a thread in the fabric of Ma'at, order, truth, and balance. To live well was to live in harmony with the world, with gods, with one's ancestors. Even the act of dying was carefully planned. A family saved what they could for a proper burial: linen wrappings, a painted coffin, a few offerings. Death was not feared so much as prepared for. Tombs, however modest, were seen as homes for the next life. And yet, through all this, the people laughed, wept, fell in love, made mistakes, and tried again. Their voices, though lost to time, echo in fragments. A love poem scratched on a pot, a name etched on a broken shabti. A worker's complaint left on Nostraca. Egypt's greatness was not built by kings alone, but by countless hands and hearts, by people who believed that even the smallest life had meaning beneath the eternal sun. Out of the long shadow of invasion, Egypt rose not quietly, but with brilliance. With the Hyksos expelled and the Nile once again under native rule, a new chapter unfolded, bolder, louder, more radiant than any before. This was the new kingdom, the Empire Age, when Egypt was not only secure but supreme. Ahmose I, the liberator, laid its foundation, and his successors built upon it with vigor and vision. Thebes became the beating heart of the nation, and Amun, once a local god of wind and breath, ascended to become the king of gods. Temples to Amun-Ra soared skyward, none more magnificent than Karnak, a forest of columns, sanctuaries, and obelisks carved with light and prayer. This was an age of builders, conquerors, and visionaries. Hatshepsut, the queen who became king, ruled with grace and genius. She wore the pharaoh's beard, stood tall in monuments, and left behind the stunning mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. Nestled against limestone cliffs, she opened trade with Punt, brought incense, gold, and exotic trees to Egypt, and ruled for 2 decades of peace and prosperity. Thutmose III, her successor, expanded Egypt's borders through 17 military campaigns, earning the title Napoleon of Egypt long before Napoleon was born. Under his leadership, Egyptian chariots thundered into Canaan, Syria, and Nubia, and tribute poured into Thebes from all directions. Egypt was now an empire, its influence stretching across the Levant, its name known in every royal court from Babylon to Byblos. Wealth flooded the land. Art became vibrant, expressive, colourful. Tombs glowed with scenes of music, love, and daily life. Hieroglyphs curved like flowing water, and gods walked among mortals in sacred narratives painted on papyrus and plaster. One pharaoh, Amenhotep IV, would even dare to reshape the divine. He renamed himself Akhenaten, rejected the pantheon, and worshipped only Aten, the sun disk. He moved the capital to a new city, Amarna, and with him came a new art. Soft, strange, intimate. Faces were elongated, bodies curved naturally. The gods were removed from public view. It was a revolution in theology and form, but it would not last. After his death, the old gods returned, and the boy king who followed, Tutankhamun, restored the old ways. Though his reign was short, his tomb, miraculously untouched for over 3,000 years, would make him the most famous pharaoh of all time. Yet it was Ramses II who would come to define the might of the new kingdom. He reigned for 66 years, built temples across Egypt, including the colossal Abu Simbel, where statues of the king sit carved into a cliff, staring across the desert for eternity. He fought the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, signed one of the world's first peace treaties, and filled the land with children, monuments, and myth. To his people, he was a living god, a symbol of power made flesh. During this golden age, the Valley of the Kings became the final resting place of pharaohs. Cut deep into stone, these hidden tombs were filled with spells, gold, and dreams of eternity. No longer building pyramids in the open, the Egyptians now sought secrecy and security, hiding their dead from tomb robbers. And yet, even here, their hope for the afterlife burned bright. The Book of the Dead, refined and expanded, guided the soul past trials, demons, and judgment toward the field of reeds, where peace was eternal. For nearly 5 centuries, the new kingdom flourished. It was Egypt at its most confident, its most expressive, its most alive. And all the while, the Nile carried their stories forward, lapping at temple stairs, whispering to the reeds, watching kings become gods and gods become memory. As the Middle Kingdom faded into twilight, Egypt stood poised between stability and silence. The pharaohs had grown older, their pyramids smaller, their grip on power looser. Beneath the calm surface, cracks widened. Foreign traders passed through border towns. Outsiders settled in the lush delta, and from the northeast, from lands beyond the Sinai, came a people whose names would echo through Egyptian memory with tension and awe, the Hyksos. Their origins were complex, likely Canaanite, their culture a blend of Semitic language, foreign gods, and new technology. They did not storm in with blazing fire. They arrived slowly, in caravans and ships, with goods and weapons unfamiliar to the Egyptians. But with them came something that would alter warfare forever: the horse-drawn chariot. Light, fast and deadly, it turned battlefields into rivers of speed. The Egyptians had never seen its like. Slowly, the Hyksos gained foothold in the northern lands, especially in the fertile city of Avaris, which they made their capital. They didn't destroy Egypt, they ruled it. For over a century, these foreign kings governed Lower Egypt, adopting Egyptian titles, dressing as pharaohs, offering to Egyptian gods. Yet the tension never eased. The Hyksos worshipped storm gods like Baal and Resheph, built temples in strange styles, and spoke languages that flowed differently from the Nile-born tongue. To the Egyptians of the south, this was a distortion, an echo of chaos returning. And yet, it was also a lesson. From the Hyksos, Egypt learned. They adopted the chariot, the composite bow, and new forms of metalwork. They expanded their understanding of trade and diplomacy. But the wound of foreign rule festered in the heart of Thebes, where native kings still held power in name, though not in reach. It was there that the spark of resistance began to glow. Pharaohs like Sekenenretau and his sons Kamose and Ahmose began pushing back. It was not merely a political fight, it was existential. They saw themselves as guardians of Ma'at, restoring order against the incursion of Isfet, or chaos. The war against the Hyksos lasted years. Battles raged along the Nile, alliances were forged, and blood stained the sand. Sekenenretau may have died violently. His skull shows brutal wounds, possibly from Hyksos weapons. But his death ignited something in Egypt's soul. Kamose continued the campaign, and finally, it was Ahmose I, young and relentless, who expelled the Hyksos completely, driving them out and raising Avaris. Egypt was free again, but forever changed. The trauma of occupation left a scar, but also a sharpened edge. The Theban rulers had won not just with swords, but with evolution. They had absorbed the tools of their enemies and used them to reclaim their land. From the ashes of resistance rose a new era, one of empire, ambition, and glory. The Hyksos were gone, but their impact endured in every chariot wheel that turned, in every soldier's training, in every wary glance cast toward the eastern horizon. And so Egypt, once fractured, now stood unified not just by river and crown, but by shared memory, of loss, of learning, of reclaiming identity. The lesson was clear. Even in the time of invasion, the heart of Egypt beat on. The Nile flowed, unchanged, through all things, through foreign kings and fallen capitals, through grief and grit. It would carry Egypt forward into its most dazzling chapter yet. After the towering ambition of the Old Kingdom, after the pyramids reached for the sky and the gods were etched into every stone, Egypt entered a long shadow. The central government began to weaken. The pharaohs lost their hold. Nomarchs, regional governors, gained power, and unity slipped through their fingers like sand through a sieve. The first intermediate period followed, a time of fragmentation, of local kings and rival courts, of uncertainty and drift. Yet even in these quieter centuries, the Nile still flowed, the seasons still turned, the people endured. And from this slow churn of instability, a new era emerged, not with trumpets or monuments, but with balance. The Middle Kingdom began around 2050 BCE, under the 11th dynasty, when a king named Mentuhotep II rose from Thebes and reunified the land. His reign marked the return of central power, but with a new tone. These rulers were not just gods on thrones. They were shepherds, stewards, listeners. The Middle Kingdom was less about grandeur, more about harmony. Pharaohs like Senusret I and Amenemhat I built temples and expanded irrigation. They sent expeditions to quarries, to the Red Sea, to the land of Punt, and deep into Nubia. Trade flourished, art shifted. The statues of kings now showed age, humanity, thoughtfulness. Not only idealized youth, literature blossomed. This was the era of the Tale of Sinuhe, the instructions of Amenemhat, the dialogue of a man with his soul, texts filled with emotion, doubt, and wisdom. The Egyptians began to ask deeper questions. What is justice? How do we face loss? What is the role of the king? These writings were copied by scribes for generations. Their messages echoed in schools and temples. The capital moved to Ijtawi, near the Fayum, and from there the pharaohs ruled with strength and subtlety. The tombs of nobles in Beni Hassan were carved into cliffs, painted with scenes of wrestling, farming, trade and dance, snapshots of daily life frozen in ochre and black. Religion continued to evolve. Amun, once a local god of Thebes, began to rise in prominence, merging with Ra to become Amun-Ra, the hidden power behind the sun. Temples to Amun appeared in Karnak, modest at first, then grander with each dynasty. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs embraced their mortality more than those before them. Their pyramids, smaller and built with mud brick, have mostly eroded, but their legacy remains in how they ruled, with order, fairness, and a deep respect for Ma'at. The focus turned inward, not just on eternity, but on living well. Justice was administered with more care. Peasants petitioned courts. Administrators tracked grain, flood levels, and census records with precision. The government functioned like the gears of a clock, steady and deliberate. Though less remembered than the pyramid builders, the Middle Kingdom's contribution to Egypt was profound. It created a model of leadership that blended might with wisdom. It gave voice to the individual soul, not just the divine king. It opened the gates of the afterlife to common people, not only to royalty. Death spells, once reserved for pharaohs, were now inscribed on coffins of ordinary folk. What we now call the coffin texts, the idea that all people had a car, a bar, and a chance at eternity became central. And so, even as the world outside Egypt shifted, within its borders, balance was restored. Crops grew, families prospered, temples sang with incense and chant, and over it all the Nile flowed, watching, reflecting, carrying the story forward in its slow, endless breath. In ancient Egypt, death was never seen as an end. It was a passage, a transition, a doorway between two realms. To the people who lived along the Nile, life and death were not opposites, but reflections. One was temporary, fragile, lit by the sun. The other, eternal, ruled by stars and judgment. From the earliest graves filled with shells and bread to the golden sarcophagi of pharaohs, every act in life was a rehearsal for what came after. Religion in Egypt was not a set of beliefs, but a total way of being, woven into harvests, into architecture, into language and law. The gods were not distant figures, they were everywhere. The morning sun was Ra, born anew each day, sailing across the sky in a golden boat, only to vanish into the underworld at night, where he would battle chaos and be reborn again at dawn. Osiris ruled the afterlife, the green-skinned god of resurrection and judgment. He had once been king on earth until he was betrayed by his brother Set, cut into pieces and reassembled by his loving wife Isis. This myth echoed the Nile's rhythm: destruction and rebirth, division and healing. Anubis, with his black jackal head, watched over mummification. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe, recorded the weight of the soul. And Ma'at, the goddess of truth and balance, was not just worshipped, but lived. She wore a feather on her head, and it was that feather against which all hearts would one day be weighed. If your heart was light with virtue, you passed into paradise. If heavy with wrongdoing, it was devoured by Ammit, the soul eater. This belief system shaped every corner of Egyptian life. Tombs were built not for memory, but for function, a vessel for the soul's journey. Walls were painted with spells, with food, with servants, with maps of the stars. Everything one might need in the afterlife was placed there, combs, sandals, beer, even little statues called Shaktis that would do your labor in the fields of Osiris. The body itself was sacred. To decay was to lose the soul. So the Egyptians developed mummification, a complex process of drying, removing organs, treating with resins, and wrapping in linen. The heart was kept in place for judgment. The brain, considered unimportant, was removed. The body was sealed in layers of cloth, prayers, and gold. Coffins were painted with eyes so the soul could see. Sarcophagi were shaped in the likeness of the deceased, because name and form mattered. To be forgotten was to die a second time. Priests performed rituals. Families made offerings. Cemeteries became cities of the dead, sprawling necropolises with streets, gates, and chapels. Yet even the poorest villagers tried to secure a good death. A modest tomb, a few amulets, a name spoken by descendants. All of it mattered. Life was lived with death in mind, and death was filled with life. The gods were many, their forms fluid. A god might be man, beast, or both. Some regions worshipped local deities more than national ones. But the central truth remained. Life was fleeting, and what came after, if properly prepared, was forever. Religion gave order to the universe, to the flooding river, to the rising sun. It explained droughts, births, dreams, and fate. It connected the farmer in the field to the pharaoh on the throne. In every chapel, every amulet, every whispered prayer, the Egyptians sought harmony with the cosmos. To live rightly was to live in Ma'at, and if one succeeded, if one's name endured and the heart remained light, then death was not to be feared, but embraced. A journey home, guided by stars, by spells, by gods who waited beyond the west. With Nama's unification echoing through the valleys of stone, Egypt entered an age of confidence, measured not by conquest, but by permanence. This was the Old Kingdom, a time when gods took shape in stone, when kings became architects of immortality, and when the desert horizon began to change forever. The third dynasty rose, and with it came a ruler named Djoser, whose name would be whispered beneath stone for millennia. He commissioned a man named Imhotep, not just an architect, but a priest, a healer, and a thinker, to build something never seen before. The result was the step pyramid of Saqqara, a stairway to heaven made of limestone, stacked layer upon layer. It was not merely a tomb, it was a statement. That man could shape eternity, and with that act Egypt began to think in stone. Pharaohs no longer settled for simple mastabas. They wanted monuments that could defy time itself. As dynasties continued, Sneferu emerged, a builder king who dreamed in angles and volume. He ordered not one, but 3 pyramids. One collapsed, one bent, and finally the first true smooth-sided pyramid at Medum. These were experiments in forever. Each stone was a prayer, each chamber a portal. But it was Sneferu's son, Khufu, who would command the building of the greatest structure the world had ever seen. The Great Pyramid of Giza, rising over 480 feet into the sky, made of more than 2 million blocks, some weighing as much as a truck. No mortar held them together, just precision, patience, and purpose. Khufu's tomb was not decorated like later dynasties. It was bare, austere, powerful. His name, carved once, hidden deep inside. The pyramid was not meant to be beautiful. It was meant to endure. And it has, for more than 4,000 years. Around it, 2 others would rise. One for his son, Khafra, and one for his grandson, Menkore, forming a triad of eternity, guarded by the enigmatic Sphinx, whose face still stares eastward with a knowing gaze. This was the age of monumentality. Art grew formal. Rules emerged for how gods and men should be depicted. Left foot forward, shoulders square, eyes eternal. Hieroglyphs blossomed. Papyrus scrolls recorded myths and offerings. Temples were built with symmetry and silence. The king was not just a ruler, he was a god among men. Horus in human form, balancing Mayat with every decree. Officials rose in ranks, cities expanded, and the Nile became not just a source of food, but of calendar and ceremony. Each season was marked by the river's rhythm. Festivals celebrated the flooding, planting, and harvest. Death rituals became more elaborate. The Book of the Dead began to form, spells, maps, protections for the journey beyond. But even in all this grandeur, life for the ordinary Egyptian remained close to the soil. Farmers worked the land with wooden ploughs. Bakers ground grain on stone. Families gathered in courtyards lit by oil lamps. Their kings built in stone, but they lived in mud brick homes. The contrast was not contradiction. It was belief in something greater, that the divine and the earthly could exist side by side. The Old Kingdom gave Egypt its spine, its architectural soul, its cosmic law, its vision of eternity. And though the stones of the pyramids would cast long shadows, the men who built them knew their names would vanish. It was the king's name that mattered, the pyramid silence that endured, and beneath it all, the Nile flowed unbothered, unchanging, as if amused by the ambitions of stone. In the soft haze of early morning, when mist curled above the river and the air was thick with silence, a man rose who would change the course of the world's oldest story. His name was Nama, though in later legends he would also be called Menes. And he was more than a man. He was the first to wear the double crown, symbol of unity between two ancient lands, the red crown of the north and the white crown of the south. For generations before him, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt had existed in a delicate tension, sometimes trading, sometimes warring, often separated by difference but bound by river. In the fertile delta, the people worshipped cobra goddesses and planted flax in wide marshes. In the stony highlands of the south, they honored falcon spirits and carved sanctuaries into cliffs. Their ways of life, their dialects, their burial practices had diverged. But the Nile, patient and eternal, ran through both. And so, it was inevitable that a leader would rise from the current and bring both worlds under one rule. Nama, a southern king of strength and cunning, marched northward, not only with warriors, but with vision. His conquests were swift, but calculated. Town by town, shrine by shrine, he claimed the delta, not in fire, but in permanence. His most famous legacy lies on a palette of stone, carved with images so ancient and symbolic they speak louder than words. The king towering above his enemies, wearing both crowns, wielding the flail and the mace, flanked by divine animals and standards of conquest. It was not merely propaganda, it was mythology in motion. With Nama's unification, Egypt was no longer a scattering of river villages, but a single kingdom stretching 1,000 kilometers along the Nile. A new capital, Memphis, rose at the very seam where Upper and Lower Egypt met. It was no accident. Nama wanted his throne at the center of balance, a place where both cultures could look to one city and see a reflection of themselves. But unification was not just about power, it was about order. The Egyptians believed in Ma'at, truth, balance, harmony. Without it, the world fell into chaos. Nama became the living embodiment of Ma'at, the divine thread between earth and heaven, man and God, order and disorder. His reign marked the beginning of dynastic Egypt, where kings were no longer simply chieftains or warriors. They were chosen vessels of the divine. With Nama, the concept of the pharaoh was born. Ruler, priest, god. It is likely that Nama commissioned the first true administrative systems, officials, scribes and overseers who managed grain, water and justice. From the moment he took the double crown, Egypt entered a new age. Stone monuments began to appear, not yet pyramids, but mastabas, bench-like tombs that hinted at more to come. Priests catalogued rituals. Early scribes carved sacred animals and kingly names into bone, ivory and slate. Trade with distant lands expanded. Cedar from Lebanon, obsidian from Nubia, incense from Punt. Egypt was open to the world, yet now rooted in identity. Nama himself, though semi-mythical, became the seed of the pharaoh ideal. Warrior, builder, lawgiver, bridge to the gods. His death was not the end, for in Egypt, kings never truly died. They journeyed into the west, toward the setting sun, their souls sailing across night skies in boats of gold. And in death, Nama became something more, an ancestor, a protector, a star. The unification he began would define Egyptian civilization for over 3,000 years. His was the first name carved on the long scroll of time, and beneath it, the Nile kept flowing, whispering stories to the reeds.